Did you know there is a conflict going on between France and Russia in Africa that can affect the whole world? While the majority of the world's attention is still on the major wars that are still raging in Gaza and Ukraine, there is another massive proxy conflict between the French and the Russians that is currently raging across the African continent and has the potential to cause havoc throughout the entire world. The world's attention was momentarily drawn to the developing proxy conflict between Moscow and Paris in July of 2023, when military officers in the enormous West African landlocked nation of Niger staged a coup d'état and toppled the government. The coup in Niger was especially shocking because it was the sixth country in the Sahel region of Africa in just 3 years since 2020 to see a successful overthrow of its government. The previous coups in Mali in 2020 and 2021, Chad, Sudan, and Guinea in 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, and Niger in 2023 all succeeded in toppling governments. It created this continuous band of recently formed governments across the entire length of Africa, from the Red Sea to the Atlantic, a strategically located area that some pundits have begun to dubiously call Africa's coup belt. And only 1 month after the July 2023 revolution in Niger toppled the country's administration, a coup in neighboring Gabon in August of the same year toppled that country's long-standing government as well. The coup belt crosses over some of the toughest conflicts occurring worldwide, which regrettably do not receive the attention they merit on a global scale. Large swaths of territory across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are currently dominated by radical Islamist factions like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who may be on the verge of unilaterally declaring their own independent jihadist states. Meanwhile, an apocalyptic civil conflict between rival generals in Sudan that broke out in April of 2023 is still raging. Both Al-Qaeda and ISIS have reorganized and moved their main operational bases from the Middle East to this region in the Sahel, amid the ongoing instability in the coup belt, following their respective collapses in Syria and Iraq and their expulsion from Afghanistan. Additionally, millions more people have been displaced and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives as a result. The top slot for lethal terror attacks in 2023 was occupied by a nation other than Afghanistan or Iraq for the first time since the Global Terrorism Index started gathering data 13 years ago. Furthermore, even in light of the widely reported scope of Hamas's October 7 strike, it was not Israel. With about 2,000 terrorist-related deaths in 2023 alone, Burkina Faso accounted for nearly 25% of all terrorist-related deaths globally. The country also saw an increase in terrorist-related violence, up 68% from 2022 to 2023. In 2023, Mali, a neighboring country, suffered from more lethal acts of terrorism than either Pakistan or Syria combined, placing it in third place globally. Due to the fact that a large portion of it is now directly under the authority of either Al-Qaeda or ISIS, the tri-point border region between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has emerged as the new hub for international terrorism in the 21st century. There is a real concern that many of these nations might be about to fall apart as states. All of these unstable and fragile nations in Africa's coup belt are past, and possibly even present, French colonies, at least politically, with the possible exception of Sudan, which has its own issues that were before the coup leaders took control and drove them out of the nation, home to thousands of French troops who were nominally fighting against groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but who were really there to defend significant French commercial interests. Together, the French troops and ambassadors have been banished from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after coups toppled their respective administrations. As a wave of anti-French sentiment sweeps the continent, hundreds or even thousands of new Russian troops from the mercenary Wagner Group and the newly renamed Russian Africa Corps have been welcomed to fight against the ongoing insurgencies in place of the French troops and ambassadors. As the positions on the board in West Africa start to quickly move away from France's area of influence and towards Russia's, much like falling dominoes, This complex proxy conflict, which intersects with the conflicts amongst West African countries, tribes, and ethnic groups, is directly opposing France's long-lasting, lucrative, and mainly undetectable neo-colonial dominance over their former directly ruled colonies in Africa. This domination has persisted for generations after the majority of Westerners thought it had ended. It directly jeopardizes the basis upon which France has for generations built her wealth. Furthermore, it seems to be a front in Russia's fight against the West that Moscow is now winning, and that very few people in the West ever cover or even fully comprehend. Therefore, it helps to understand the uniquely exploitative history of French colonialism in Africa, as well as the uniquely long-lasting remnants of French neo-colonialism that have persisted long past all other former European colonial regimes in Africa into the present, and how all of this intersects with geography, climate change, and Russia's own current geopolitical objectives and ambitions. This will help you to understand why Russia is beating France here, why the Sahel region of Africa has become so unstable in the 2020s, and why it's also crucial to the future of both Europe and Africa. Add your voice to the liberation of Africa by dropping a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's continue. Stretching about 3,500 kilometers, 2,200 miles, from the Atlantic in the west to the Red Sea in the east, the Sahel area is a long, thin stretch of desert land that crosses the African continent. It is a zone of biogeographical transition between the moist savannas and rainforests farther to the south, and the enormous deserts of the Sahara to the north. Furthermore, the Arabic term meaning shoreline, that is, the sandy Sahara seashore, is the source of the region's name, Sahel. Throughout the course of thousands of years, the region situated on the Saharan coast became a global hub for trade and a highly prosperous area globally due to the presence of inland commercial ports. The region's natural and human resources, such as gold, ivory, and slaves, were transported northward by vast camel trains, and luxury goods were transported southward by them. As a result, cities like Timbuktu and Gao in modern-day Mali became important trading hubs during the Middle Ages between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean. This brought the Sahel region enough wealth and prosperity that Timbuktu was the center of the empire of Mansa Musa, who is sometimes considered to have been the richest person to have ever lived. In the 14th century, it was one of the largest towns on earth. However, new marine trading routes for these resources between sub-Saharan Africa and the European world were created when European trading vessels started to travel along the African west coast starting in the 15th century. Trade routes moved from the new marine ports in Ghana and the Ivory Coast to the interior ports of Timbuktu and Gao. And during the ensuing centuries, the Sahel's economic fortunes started to decline. The relatively small French colonial empire in Africa, which had already been established in modern-day Algeria, Senegal, and Gabon, had grown dramatically along arbitrary lines by the time of the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, to encompass nearly the whole west of the continent and the vast majority of the Sahel region. Then, without considering the historically significant overland camel trading routes that remained vital for the region's nomadic peoples who had no concept of nation-states or established communities, the French colonial empire quickly spread over the continent. Biogeographic realities such as the ecological distinctions between the Sahara, the Sahel, and the wetter southern regions were also overlooked by the French. Furthermore, the French did not consider the distinctions between nomadic and established communities, nor did they take into consideration the boundaries between different ethnic groups. Like the other Europeans who divided up Africa at the time, the French colonial authorities only had one goal in mind: seizing control of the region's abundant natural resources, establishing their own power, and overthrowing the indigenous political elite. In 1848, The French even went so far as to announce that Algeria was being absorbed directly into the French nation itself, in contrast to other European colonial operations in Africa during the 19th and 20th centuries. Algeria, therefore, was more than just a colony from Paris' point of view. And like Paris, it was considered an essential component of France for over a century up to the 1960s. Following Algeria's conquest in 1848, hundreds of thousands of European French settlers arrived to colonize the country. By 1959, when Algeria was still governed by France, there were over 1.4 million French settlers living there, accounting for roughly 13% of the country's total population. Following the end of World War II, during which Nazi Germany had occupied France for years, the French economy was in ruins. As a result, France's post-conflict leaders attempted to use their extensive colonial project in Africa to both compete with the Soviet Union and the United States, and to maintain their status as a major global power. This included France's post-conflict proposal to retaliate against the US-dominated global financial system by introducing a brand new currency known as the CFA franc, an abbreviation for the French colonies in Africa franc, for all of their African possessions in 1945. In order to intentionally fortify the French franc against the US dollar in the post-conflict era, the CFA franc, which was to be utilized in France's African colonies, was to be paid directly to the French franc. In order to create a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar, the French franc underwent devaluation towards the end of 1945. By 1948, the CFA franc was paid to the French franc at a rate of 2 French francs to 1 CFA franc. This prevented the CFA franc from experiencing the same devaluation as the French franc and purposefully overvalued it in relation to the French franc. In practical terms, this meant that the colonies that used the CFA franc would have to pay more to export their raw materials to any country that wasn't France, because France would profit from the easy exchange rate between their currencies. This would eventually make the exports of CFA franc users to any other country less competitive. In essence, this allowed France to import raw materials for less than market rates from its African colonies, and then sell the completed goods back for more than market rates. At the same time, it also made the colony's imports of manufactured goods from France less expensive than from anywhere else. Additionally, French corporations could open mines and operate in the colonies to extract resources, while readily transporting their profits back home to France, without worrying about swings in foreign currencies due to the CFA franc's easy convertibility to the French franc. For the French, it was a brilliant method and bargain that allowed Paris to move rather cleverly earn income from their African colonies to themselves, so funding part of their post-World War II economic recovery. However, by the middle of the 1950s, Africans' desire for independence from Europe was growing. These cries for independence in their colonies were first met with tremendous brutality from France. Following Algeria's revolt in 1954 to overthrow the French colonial project there, a bloody 7-year struggle for independence ensued. Because Paris still formally recognized Algeria as a vital and fundamental part of France, the French were especially brutal in suppressing the Algerian independence movement. It is estimated that around 1 million Algerians were slain by the French army during the 7 years of the conflict, in a campaign of widespread and savage murders and other atrocities. Over 2 million Algerians were picked up and sent to detention camps administered by the French, while at least 8,000 Algerian communities were razed. During the conflict, the French also used the sparsely populated Algerian Sahara as a nuclear weapons testing location. Between 1960 and 1966, the nation tested and detonated 17 nuclear weapons, exposing thousands of residents to radiation. The brutality and exorbitant expenditures of the Algerian conflict, coupled with worldwide support from France's allies like the United States, gradually shifted public opinion in France and drove it to end in 1962 when Algeria gained independence. It caused more than 900,000 French colonists living in Algeria to flee in large numbers to metropolitan France out of fear of facing retaliation from Algeria. And although all of this horror and violence was being witnessed by the world in Algeria, France started trying to hold on to the rest of their African colonies using more surreptitious, less costly, less violent, and less detrimental to international relations strategies. The French effectively hijacked and co-opted genuine independence movements in the remaining West African colonies after forcing the CFA franc currency upon them in 1945. They did this by courting, influencing, and putting their own hand-picked local elites into positions of power as essentially puppets before offering them their theoretical independence. After that, Paris extended so-called cooperation agreements to each of these colonies, outlining the terms of their post-independence relationship with France. The terms of these agreements varied throughout colonies. They occasionally gave French businesses ongoing access to their natural resources with preferential treatment. They occasionally made it possible for the French to keep their military outposts in their nations. However, they consistently recommended that the colonies stay part of the CFA franc exchange system. The French have always depicted the colonies' acceptance of these cooperation agreements and continued membership in the CFA franc system after 1958 as an allegedly fully voluntary arrangement, where, after independence, everyone was free to say yes or no. However, the French also made it quite evident what would happen to any of these potential nations once they gained independence if they refused to accept the agreement. Of all the French colonies in Africa, Guinea was the only one to blatantly refuse French proposals after gaining independence in 1958, including the option to stay in the CFA franc system. Sékou Touré, the leader of Guinea at the time, boldly stated in front of Charles de Gaulle, the President of France, that he would rather be impoverished in freedom than wealthy in servitude. The French therefore made the decision to make him and Guinea as miserable an example as they could. Guinea received early independence from France in exchange for their complete withdrawal from the country. However, whatever that they could find that they believed to have been French contributions to Guinean society was purposefully destroyed and torn down as they were leaving. They unscrewed the light bulbs in their offices and transported them all back to France. They also burnt their plans for the capital's drainage system and destroyed their medication instead of leaving it behind. Guinea then turned to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for financial experts to help them develop their own independent currency in 1959. The French saw this as a direct threat to their CFA franc system and eliminated all French foreign aid to Guinea. As a result, they started flooding Guinea with counterfeit Guinean currency in an attempt to cause hyperinflation and collapse their economy. They even initiated the process of equipping rebels in Guinea. And the French reacted with equally brutal means to other threats in Africa against their neo-colonial regime. Félix Roland Moumié, a leading anti-colonialist from Cameroon, was terminated in 1960 in Switzerland by the French Secret Service. Employing a technique similar to the one Vladimir Putin is currently utilizing to eliminate his rivals in Europe. They delivered him a death that was excruciatingly painful after poisoning him with radioactive thallium. Large uranium reserves were identified in a remote area of northern Niger by French geologists in 1957, just before the colonies started to obtain offers of independence. And as it happened, Niger turned out to have the finest quality uranium ore ever found on the African continent, as well as the 7th largest known uranium reserves in the world. At first, the French desired to maintain their access to this uranium in Niger in order to build up their own sovereign nuclear weapons stockpile and gain strategic independence from both the US and the USSR. Later on, though, they also desired to keep having access to Niger's uranium in order to fuel their rapidly expanding nuclear energy sector. Since the opening of the country's first commercially operated uranium mines in 1971, uranium from Niger has grown to be a vital part of France's energy policy. The French have pursued nuclear power with greater vigor than any other nation in the world. As of 2024, the nation is home to 56 nuclear reactors spread over 18 different nuclear power stations, producing about 63% of France's total electrical output. France presently needs about 8,000 tons of raw uranium ore per year to power them and keep producing all that electricity. Additionally, all of the uranium needs to be imported from outside of France because none of it is found there. By far, the biggest producer of uranium in the modern world is Kazakhstan, which as of 2022 accounted for 43% of global output. In contrast, Niger is a relatively small participant globally, contributing only 5% of global production. However, Niger's exports have always been costly and uncompetitive due to the way the CFA franc financial system has operated in France's former colonies for decades after their theoretical independence. Unless they are exported to France, where they can be bought for less than market value using their own undervalued currency that was paid to the overvalued CFA franc. With no other option, Niger was forced to sign egregiously unjust contracts with French multinational corporations that would use their uranium resources and then return them to France. 3 uranium mines are currently operated by Uranium, a multinational uranium mining business with its headquarters located in Paris, and 90% owned by the French government. As of 2024, only one of these mines is still actively operating. Niger is still an important source of uranium imports for France, despite being a relatively small producer of uranium, 5% of total output worldwide. Approximately 37% of France's uranium imports in 2022 came from Kazakhstan, the largest producer and supplier of uranium in the world. Nonetheless, Niger accounted for 20% of France's imports of uranium in that same year, making it the country's second largest supplier. This meant that in 2022, international corporations with French ownership, such as Uranium, exported to France 80% of the uranium produced in Niger, which later generated about 12.5% of France's total electricity. Put another way, roughly 8 million French people still rely on uranium imports from Niger to power their houses. Thus, France's primary strategic interest in Niger's uranium has persisted to this day. In contrast, Niger's GDP is derived from mining of minerals such as uranium, which accounts for barely 3% of the country's export volume. Because Niger has never kept a large portion of the proceeds from uranium mining, and once France had granted them independence, Paris wanted to keep access to raw minerals from her colonial empire. Not just the uranium of Niger. When Gabon was still a French possession under direct authority, significant oil resources were found there in 1931. As with Niger's uranium, the French also desired to keep access to the oil when Gabon gained formal independence in 1960. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, essentially conducted an interview with Omar Bongo, a Gabonese man, in the middle of the 1960s before appointing him to the role. A devout supporter of France, Bongo governed Gabon for many years until his death in 2009. His young son Ali Bongo then assumed power and carried on the pro-French dictatorship until his own overthrow in August 2023. In exchange for an annual bribe that occasionally reached 50 million euros, the Bongo family allowed Total, the forerunner of today's massive French oil business, to dominate Gabonese oil production throughout the decades that they controlled the nation. The Bongo government in Gabon received funding from France, according to a 1988 New York Times investigation. The majority of this funding went directly into Omar Bongo's personal account, allowing the Bongos to amass absurd wealth, while the French were able to keep their permanent military presence in the nation and their exclusive access to the oil and other resources of the nation. One of the richest heads of state in the world, Omar Bongo had over $130 million hidden in the bank's personal accounts, according to a 1999 US Senate probe into Citibank. During his more than 40 years in leadership, Gabon's GDP per capita growth, driven primarily by oil, was among the highest in Africa. Yet during that time, his administration barely completed 5 kilometers of new roads annually. At the time of his death in 2009, Gabon still had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world, and a third of the population lived in poverty, primarily as a result of the Bongo family's hoarding of the country's wealth for France and themselves. At some point, Omar Bongo reportedly stated that the Bongo family was so extraordinarily wealthy as a result of their decades-long corruption and exploitation of their own people for the benefit of France, that in 2007, his daughter-in-law made an odd appearance on the reality TV show Really Rich Real Estate on the US music channel VH1. There, she attempted to purchase a $25 million mega mansion in Malibu, California. France's enduring and enchanting hold over its former colonies in West Africa, which it had theoretically granted independence in the early 1960s, became so strong and comprehensive that it inspired the term Freak French Africa. Between 1960 and the mid-1990s, the French launched no fewer than 122 separate military interventions into Africa to safeguard their ongoing economic interests throughout France and Africa. One such intervention occurred in 1990 when hundreds of French Marines and tanks were sent to Gabon to assist in quelling riots that had broken out against their puppet, Omar Bongo's rule. Furthermore, the CFA franc system has generally continued to benefit France for decades after the formal independence of France's colonies in West Africa was granted in 1960. Though its initial aim has largely stayed intact, its name has changed over the years to what it is now, an acronym for the Financial Community of Africa franc in French, instead of the old French colonies in Africa franc. Certain nations have left the system, such as Guinea at the beginning and Madagascar and Mauritania in 1973. Others, such as Equatorial Guinea in 1985 and Guinea-Bissau in 1997, joined but were never originally French possessions. However, 14 countries in West and Central Africa still speak it as their primary language. Most of these were formerly under direct French colonial administration. And the CFA franc simply evolved to become paid to the euro, instead of the old French franc after France adopted the euro in 1999. As of 2024, the peg has not changed since 1999, and is still fixed at €1 being exactly 655.957 CFA francs. The fact that the CFA franc is tied to the euro has helped keep these 14 African countries' currencies stable and their inflation rates low when compared to their neighbors, according to modern proponents of the CFA franc system, who are almost exclusively French or European. For instance, compared to neighboring Ghana, which has never used the CFA franc, the inflation rate in Ivory Coast, which has always maintained its usage of the currency, has been noticeably lower. Both Equatorial Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, which were never French colonies and were not initially included in the CFA franc when it was first proposed in 1945, chose to subsequently join the CFA franc system in 1985 and 1997 respectively, mostly due to a desire to curb what at the time was their out-of-control inflation rates and stabilize their own currency systems. Though there are certain benefits to the system, most of the counterarguments against the CFA franc originate from Africans themselves and cover a wide range of noteworthy topics. For starters, their monetary policies are still essentially set by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt and are not under their own sovereign authority because their currencies are closely linked to the euro. And the CFA franc countries of Africa have quite different economic agendas from those of the European Central Bank. While most underdeveloped African countries using the CFA franc are primarily interested in investing in infrastructure and creating jobs for their people, policies that drive up inflation, the European Central Bank is primarily concerned with fighting inflation within the highly developed economies of the Eurozone and Europe. Historically, Members of the CFA franc are also required to retain 50% of their liquid reserves in safekeeping with the French Treasury in Paris until 2019. The European Central Bank still effectively controls their monetary policy, which is frequently against their best interests. Despite the fact that this policy was removed in 2019 through a reform, France continues to print all of the CFA franc currency in circulation. For decades, people have argued that these countries, along with France Afrique, have never fully achieved their independence and sovereignty from France because they lack control over their own monetary policy. As a result, their fight for actual decolonization is still going strong today. Furthermore, because the exports from and imports into these CFA franc countries have remained less expensive than they would have been elsewhere, this has continued to benefit France and Europe financially. However, it has also severely limited these countries' ability to generate substantial profits from their exports, making export-driven economic growth in them all but impossible to achieve and further discouraging the development of any domestic industries. For these reasons, the inflation rates of CFA franc users have been lower than those of their neighbors, but they have also historically had much lower rates of economic growth. When you compare Ghana, who does not use the CFA franc, with Ivory Coast, you'll notice that Ghana's GDP per capita has increased nearly annually since 1983, while Ivory Coast's GDP per capita actually peaked decades ago in 1978 and has never recovered. And throughout the entire CFA franc region, the narrative is essentially the same. Just 5 years after formally gaining independence from France, in 1965, Niger's real GDP per capita reached an all-time high and has never fully recovered. The real GDP per capita of Gabon peaked in 1976 and has never recovered, whereas the real GDP per capita of the Republic of the Congos and Cameroon peaked in the 1980s and have similarly never recovered. The local authoritarian rulers who lead these CFA franc countries, who are typically tightly connected to France, have been encouraged to simply loot what little wealth there is for themselves and their own tribes because domestic economic growth has always been so low in these countries, which makes the underlying economic problems and growth-related obstacles more worse. Since more than 60 years ago, when most Westerners believed that European colonialism in Africa had ended, the entire system has enriched France at the expense of the vast majority of Africans. When he said, quote, "Don't forget one thing, and that is that a large portion of the money that we have in our purses comes precisely from the exploitation of Africa over the centuries." Then French President Jacques Chirac summed up the full problem in 2007. Thus, we require a modicum of common sense, not charity, but rather using common sense and justice to return to Africans what we have taken from them, is what I meant to express. This is essential if we hope to avert the worst possible instability and hardship, along with all the political fallout that this will bring in the near future. Therefore, Chirac realized as early as 2007 that if significant changes were not made to France's exploitative system in Africa, Africans themselves would eventually rebel against it, particularly given the region's demographics were predicted to continue expanding well into the 21st century. Since the year 2000, the populations of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad have all grown by more than 100%. And as these countries' populations have rapidly increased, so has their capacity to scrutinize and oppose their Francophonic economic systems. Moreover, the borders of nation-states that the French imposed on the Sahel and elsewhere in Africa were mostly arbitrarily defined and didn't line up with the region's ancient and still important overland trade routes, nor with the region's many different ethnicity and tribes, many of whom have always been nomadic herding people who have never understood the concept of European-style nation-states and have never respected what they considered to be arbitrary and porous borders, carving across their ancient herding lands. The Tuareg are one of these nomadic ethnic groups in the area still today, without a state of their own, whose traditional lands span across the sparsely populated parts of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Algeria, and Libya. The Fulani are another ethnic group across the Sahel without a single state of their own who number about 38 million today, an estimated one-third of whom continue to be fully nomadic, which makes them the largest nomadic pastoral group remaining anywhere in the contemporary world. In addition to all of these issues, climate change has been making the region more vulnerable to conflict in the 21st century. Global temperatures have risen by an average of 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.1 degrees Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. However, the average temperature rise in the Sahel region has been estimated to be 50% higher than that. Since the mid-1900s, the Sahel's rapidly increasing populations have stripped most of the region's land bare of trees for firewood. Meanwhile, a corresponding increase in the number of cattle present in nomadic herds has meant that more of the region's grass started to be consumed. This, along with the loss of trees, has resulted in rapidly increasing soil erosion and increased desertification. The Sahara Desert is thought to have expanded by approximately 8% since 1950 and has moved further into the Sahel region by about 100 kilometers or 62 miles. This trend is only anticipated to continue for the remainder of the 21st century. The Fulani and other nomadic people of the Sahel, such as the Tuareg, are physically forced to move their herds onto other areas when their lands are flooded by sand and when increased droughts and erosion kill their grasses for grazing, which typically creates the opportunity for violence. The Tuaregs, in particular, have never really recognized the legitimacy of the post-colonial states that they have always perceived as being imposed upon them. One of the most catastrophic challenges to the Franc system that had ever occurred was the major Tuareg rebellion in northern Mali in 2012, which succeeded in taking over the entire country before declaring independence as the so-called State of Azawad before it was all co-opted by Islamist forces, such as Al-Qaeda. At the time, it looked to Paris as though militants backed by Al-Qaeda were on the verge of expanding from the north of Mali and toppling the entire country, and setting up a jihadist state similar to the Taliban's Afghanistan on the doorstep of Europe. If they had been successful, millions of refugees would have probably fled northward to Europe, and the Tuaregs might have grown more ambitious and started expanding across their other ethnic lands like in Niger, where the French government decided to launch a major military intervention in 2013 at the request of the Malian government itself in order to beat back the rebels in Mali and regain control over the entire country. More than 5,000 French troops were quickly deployed and quickly re-secured control over the country for the Malian government. And after that, the French settled in for a protracted counterinsurgency campaign in the Sahel that was ostensibly in place to push back against Islamist rebels in the area in order to defend the sovereignty of states like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad. But it was also, at its height, the French counterinsurgency operation in the Sahel in the late 2010s, also known as Operation Barkhane, comprised 5,500 deployed French troops, supported by an additional 5,000 troops committed by the Sahel states themselves: Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Mauritania. However, that amounted to little more than 10,000 total troops tasked with patrolling and monitoring a vast area of the African continent, approximately 1.9 million square miles in area, or roughly 60% of the size of the continental 48 United States. They could not possibly defend this entire region, and were thus largely forced to rely on drones and special forces in this vast and sparsely populated expanse of land that the Islamist forces could always just retreat into and practically disappear from view. Al-Qaeda, and later ISIS, capitalized on these people's deep-seated grievances, and by mid-2015, they were already back in northern and central Mali. By 2016, they had expanded their operations across the porous, sparsely populated, and likely defended borders into neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger as well, and the scale of violence exploded to unprecedented levels. Between 2007 and 2022, deaths from terrorism in the Sahel rose by an almost unbelievable 2,000%, while the epicenter of global terror attacks shifted away from the around 20,000 people have been killed in terror attacks in Burkina Faso since 2015 alone. The year the French-led counterinsurgency operation in the Sahel began. And after the French troops were driven out of the country in 2022, the violence increased even further, to the point where the country is now the deadliest in the world for terrorism. An Islamist faction in Mali known as JNIM, which is backed by Al-Qaeda, currently controls a large swath of northwest Mali along the border with Mauritania, while another group calling itself the Islamic State Sahel province dominates the Tri-Point area and large swaths of land across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, more moderate secular Tuareg rebels are once again in control of most of the rest of northern Mali. As the insurgencies continued spiraling out of control, many Africans in these countries began to wonder if the French were really there to protect the Africans at all, or if they were really just there to protect their own continued national interests and the continuation of the exploitative franc system that had lingered on for the past 60 years. This building anti-French sentiment in the Sahel eventually boiled over in Mali by 2021, when a coup led by military officers brought a newfound sense of animosity toward the French. Following this, the newly established government drove out the 1,000 French soldiers who had remained in the country as part of France's counterinsurgency operation throughout Sahel, and even cut off diplomatic ties with Paris by expelling the French ambassador. Immediately grasping the exceptional opportunity created by this, the Russian mercenary Wagner Group, then headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, stepped in to fill the void left by France's abrupt departure, offering up their own troops to replace the French in Mali's ongoing battle against the Islamist insurgencies, an offer that was promptly accepted by the Malian junta. Eventually, without anyone realizing it, 1,000 Russian mercenaries hired by the Wagner Group were deployed into Mali. The Wagner Group's activities in Africa began relatively recently, having only been established in 2017 when they dispatched a small number of advisors and geologists to help warlord Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo and his rapid support forces gain access to the gold mines that he controlled in Sudan. The Central African Republic, which is neighboring, then served as a testing ground for Wagner's potential capabilities, as the nation has been embroiled in a civil conflict for over 10 years, since 2012. However, in 2017, the government of that nation started hiring Wagner's mercenaries for military duty, and by 2021, about 2,000 Wagner mercenaries have participated in the government's major counteroffensive and restored government control over most of the country's major towns. The Wagner Group was happy to fan the pre-existing flames of anti-French sentiment across the Sahel for their own benefit, and it did so just in time after the new anti-French government in Mali took over and expelled their previous French partners. The Wagner Group, and by extension Russia, was able to present itself to these countries as a capable and alternative security partner to France, without any of the colonial and neo-colonial baggage that Paris carries around with it in the region. Additionally, despite the Wagner Group's accusations of committing multiple conflict crimes and massacres across Afghanistan, after Prigozhin's ill-fated mutiny against the Kremlin in March on Moscow failed, that almost certainly cost him his life in a supposed plane crash in August of 2023, the Russian government recognized the usefulness of his operations he had built across Africa, and so they've largely all been reformed now into the semi-officially named Africa Corps. This rebranded Wagner Group in Africa is no longer a privately owned enterprise like it was under Prigozhin, but is now directly controlled by the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU. After further anti-French coups replaced governments in Burkina Faso in 2022 and in Niger in 2023, the new Africa Corps has been quick to offer them similar deals as they have with Mali, which are so-called regime survival packages. Essentially, the Africa Corps will send their troops into these countries to protect their leadership and fight against their insurgencies and rebellions going on in them in exchange for access to their raw materials that Russia wants, especially gold. Control over or access to these gold mines in the Sahel has been a major objective of the Islamists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to continue covertly funding their operations, and it is now also a major objective of the Russian Africa Corps, who wish to smuggle the gold out of these major mines across the region's porous borders back towards Russia itself, as a means of covertly evading Western sanctions to keep funding their conflict effort in Ukraine. Mali and Burkina Faso are the second and third largest gold producers in Africa, only surpassed by Ghana. If their gold productions were combined, they would be the fourth largest gold producers in the entire world, remaining roughly equivalent to Canada. In addition to securing Russian access to raw materials here like gold, the Africa Corps is also being tasked with disrupting French access to as much of the same raw materials in the region as possible. Leaked documents have already shown the Africa Corps intentions to weaponize their budding relationship with Niger, to threaten continued French access to the uranium mines in the country that power more than 12% of France's electricity. The three main anti-French junta-led Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have all either welcomed the Africa Corps into their countries already or are in the process of doing so in Niger's case, while all French troops from them have been expelled and relations with France severed. The three states also announced their own new military defense pact, called the Alliance of Sahelian States, and then in January of 2024, they all announced their formal withdrawals from the ECOWAS regional alliance system, months after fears of a conflict between themselves and the rest of ECOWAS had largely subsided. Then, in February 2024, the Alliance of Sahelian States started holding high-level talks about further withdrawing from the CFA franc system. The new leader of Niger insisted that in order for Niger to truly achieve its full sovereignty and decolonize from France, it had to regain its full monetary sovereignty from Paris, something it hasn't done in centuries. And the new leader of Burkina Faso vowed that his country would never be ruled by Europeans again. If they do end up moving forward with abandoning the CFA franc, it will be the largest defection from the system that France has ever witnessed in her former colonies since the system was created in 1945. They have also talked about replacing it with their own currency, and whether or not they succeed, their brazen defiance of France has already captivated the imagination of millions of other Africans living throughout the remainder of the CFA franc system, who harbor similar long-standing grievances against the way that the French have treated and exploited them for generations now. Less than a month had passed since the successful coup in Niger, when another successful coup in Gabon finally overthrew the 56-year-old, fiercely pro-French dictatorship there, ruled by the Bongo family, whom Charles de Gaulle himself had personally appointed to power, and who knew how many more coups might occur throughout the region in the future. It only recognized the impending wave of change and chose to ride it out in order to further its own goals and interests. In many ways, this has been a long-term reckoning for France's exploitative project in Africa, and much of it can be traced back to the massive Tuareg rebellion that erupted in northern Mali in 2012, which started this whole chain of events that the Sahel is still experiencing and coping with today. The year prior to that rebellion, another uprising against the long-standing regime of Muammar Gaddafi broke out across the Sahara and nearby Libya. NATO warplanes, including French warplanes, began a military intervention against Gaddafi's army and successfully destroyed it, which allowed the Libyan rebels to quickly overthrow Gaddafi. Then, after having inadvertently caused this rebellion in Mali to have happened in the first place by bombing Libya first, the French were forced to correct their error by sending 5,000 troops into Mali to push back the Tuareg rebellion that became influenced by Al-Qaeda. France's intervention into Mali then sort of became France's own version of Afghanistan or Iraq. Thousands of highly experienced Tuareg mercenaries that Gaddafi had hired and paid for with his oil wealth, simply took all of their heavy weapons and returned home to northern Mali. After that, they were helping to lead the new Tuareg rebellion against the central government in Mali, capturing territory in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and turning the area into the heart of international terrorism that the French were unable to contain. It turned into France's never-ending conflict as the bases of Al-Qaeda and ISIS moved from the Middle East to the Sahel. Do you think Russia will be able to end the terrorism in the Sahel region that France did not succeed to end? What do you think will happen to Africa if all nations are controlled by military governments? Tell us what you think in the comments section below, and please do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one.